friends. My name is Miss Chris and we want to welcome you to the library. Now today, we're going to be talking about one of my pets. Now, I have a dog and I have a cat. I even used to have a horse, but that's not the pets we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to be talking about my pet worms. Now, who has pet worms? Well, I do, and I actually keep them in the kitchen in a bin. And what the worms do is that they eat all of my food scraps. So you know how normally, like if you have leftover crusts of bread or maybe the tops of bell peppers, and probably don't want to eat those. So you put them in the trash and the trash goes to the landfill. Well, what I do instead is that I put them in my compost bin, which is where my worms live, and they turn those food scraps into worm castings, which help fertilize the soil. Would you like to meet my pet worms today? So I put a couple of my worms in this bowl, and let's look and see what they look like. Now these are special worms. These right here are called red wigglers. Now red wigglers are also called tiger worms. Now red wigglers are really important in composting because these worms can eat up to twice their body weight every single day. Can you imagine if you ate 2 times as much as what you weigh? Oh, that would be a lot of good food. I couldn't do that, but worms can. So this is what my one pet worm looks like. And in this much soil, there are probably about 25 worms. That's a lot of worms for one little bit. But this right here is actually where my worms live. This is called a composting bin. And in my composting bin, I have to have a lid on it. And this is where they live. Now this is not what this used to look like. I'm going to have to harvest some of this good soil right here. And this soil is actually called castings. Castings is worm poop. But do you see how this is all brown and kind of crumbly? That is what those worms turn all of my food scraps into. And so what I can do with this is I can sprinkle it on potted plants. I can put it in the ground when I'm planting seeds. I can even put this with water and water plants with it. And that's called compost tea. Now, this is a big composting bin. So this is a good size one for a family. But you might not want to have a compost bin that's quite this big. Maybe you want to start with a small one. So let's see what a small one would look like. And we can even build one together today. Now, if you want to make a compost bin at home, what you'll need is a locking plastic bin. And we want to make sure it locks because every once in a while we accidentally knock it over and stuff. And we want to make sure that our castings and our worms and our food scraps don't fall on the ground. So you just need something that's locking like this. Now it's best to use something that's got darker plastic, like my big compost bin. However, the small clear plastic ones are really cool so that you can see the science behind it. And it's a good starter compost bin. Now, once you get your small plastic locking compost bin, see it locks on the side, you're going to grab an adult and you are going to drill holes. And you want to make for sure that they're small holes, like smaller than the worm width, but you need a whole bunch of them. You need some on top, some on the sides, but most importantly, you need some on the bottom, and be sure you put several on the bottom. Now the reason why for that is because if the compost bin accidentally gets waterlogged, you don't want to drown your worms. So make for sure that you've got plenty of holes down there so that if there's any excess water, it can escape out the bottom. So once we have our holes drilled, we need to start filling our bin. So to start, we're going to fill the bottom of our composting bin with shredded paper. And we're going to call this bedding, kind of like you have bedding for your pet sheep, or maybe your pet hamster, or your pet rabbit. So you can use shredded newspaper, or you can use shredded homework that you no longer need anymore, or you could use shredded envelopes that come in the mail. Just make for sure that you take away any plastic and any staples. Also, if you're using newspaper, try to use paper that does not have any colored ink on it, or very little colored ink. The worms don't really like that color. It can become toxic for them. So you're going to fill your bin up fairly tall. However, worms don't like dry paper, so we're going to wet the paper. I'm going to wet about half of it in here, and we're going to see why in just a second. First, we need to get some in here. I've got a good amount of paper in here, and I'm going to mix it all up. Now my paper is not quite wet enough. I need a little bit more water. So what's really good to have around your composting bin is a spray bottle with water in it. You know how like you have to water your other pets every day or twice a day, or sometimes if you've got one of those really good waters, you can do it every 4 days. We're going to make for sure our worms have enough water. So we're going to spray the paper. Let's see if this is wet enough. Not quite yet. Ooh, that feels good. So what you want to do is that you're going to take your paper and you're going to try to squeeze it. It needs to feel as damp as a wet sponge. Now, because I don't want to feed my worms every day, because I really don't want to disturb their quiet every day, I keep this mason jar on my countertop, and it has a lid on it when at home. And in this, I put all of my fruit and veggie scraps. Now, worms can't eat everything that you eat, so what can they eat? They can eat fruits and veggies. Now, they can't eat citrus though. So citrus is things like grapefruit and limes and lemons and oranges. They don't like that. That's a little too sour for them. But they can eat things like watermelon, or like the rinds on it, or they can eat the cores on the apple. They can eat the tops of the carrots, or have you ever seen those leafy parts on the carrots, the carrot greens? They love that. That's good vitamins for them. They can eat coffee grounds. Do you have anybody in your family that drinks coffee? You can put coffee grounds in there. They can also do tea bags. If you're a family that drinks tea, you can put that whole tea bag straight into your composting bin. You don't even need to open it up. And then also remember that shredded paper. Let's see, they can also eat, if you don't like the crust on your bread, they can eat that. You can do bread every once in a while, just not all the time. Or if you have a couple of extra strands of spaghetti that somebody didn't want, it's okay to do that a little bit, just not much. Also, rice or potato peels. Those are also sometimes foods. You know how you have always foods that are good for you, and then you have sometimes foods? Worms are just like that. But what can they not eat? They also cannot eat meat or bones. They also don't like dairy, so no cheese, no milk. They also don't like spicy or salty or greasy foods. Do not give them anything that's non-edible, so like styrofoam No. Or plastic? No. Do not put anything like cat litter or dog waste in your worm bin. Worms don't like it. Okay, so let's put some food for our worms in the bin. Let's see, I had some bananas this morning for a snack. Now, this looks very yummy to a worm. And unless you're Tabitha Brown, you're probably not going to be making this. Tabitha Brown has a really good vegan banana bacon recipe, but I'm not ready to make that today. So instead, I'm going to give it to my worms. Now, my worms don't like big pieces of food, so I'm going to tear my banana a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect. They are not going to judge you, but the smaller you get it, the faster they will eat it. So very quickly, I'm just going to shred that in there. Remember, it does not need to be perfect. That looks good. So what else can we put in there? Well, the other day, I got a really good bunch of spinach from the farmer's market. It made a yummy salad. I love fresh spinach. I love to eat the leaves when they're really crispy, but what I don't like is the stems. So I pulled off all those stems. And am I going to throw it in the trash? No. Instead, I'm going to feed it to my worms. Now, I've already broken it up, and I also had some other leaves from some other vegetables. I don't remember what those were, but we're going to put that in there. Oh, and I had the end of a piece of bread. Now, my family called this the heel. What does your family call it? Now remember, we're going to tear this into smaller pieces. Worms don't have very big mouths, and so imagine a teeny tiny worm trying to eat into this. They would have to go, that would look rather silly. All right, good job. So we're going to set this aside. Now, something else really cool about worms is they have gizzards. Now, there's another animal that has a gizzard. Oh, chickens. Chickens have gizzards. And they actually have to eat things like small stones in order for the food to grind up in their stomach. Well, for gizzards, for worms, what they need is grit. Now, you can get them grit in many different ways. Right here, I've got some soil. I just went and got this from my yard. You can put that in there. You don't need much, just a little bit. Or, did you use your family like coffee? You can put in coffee grounds. They love coffee, and probably the extra caffeine that goes in there too. But what can I do with this coffee filter? We're just going to tear it up and put it right in there. Notice all the things that are not going to the landfill. But this morning for breakfast, before I came into the library, I had some yummy scrambled eggs. And I have some eggshells. There's a white eggshell. There's brown eggshells. I am just going to crumble these up in my hand. We're going to go squish, 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 squish. Do you see them crumbled up in my hands? And now we're just going to sprinkle those into our composting bin. Oh, I've got a few more. I had a lot of eggs this morning. They were very delicious. Sprinkle those in here. So remember, you don't have to have all of these things. You can just have some of them. Use what you have. Just remember that you need to have some fruits and vegetables in there, and you need to have something that has grit in there. So like coffee or tea grounds or soil, or you could even put cornmeal in there. And I'll eat the cornmeal. Not too much though, or the eggshells. The other thing about eggshells is it helps put calcium into the soil. We love calcium. Okay, now that we have our food scraps in here, we need to put more bedding on top. we're not going to add our worms just yet. The reason why we're not going to add our worms just yet is because worms do not like light. So we want to keep them in the dark as long as possible. So we're going to add more paper. Remember? Oh, do you know what else I have? I have an empty toilet paper roll. What are toilet paper rolls made out of? Paper. So instead of putting this in the trash or even taking it to the recycling center, we can just feed it to our worms so that we can make more compost. So again, we're going to tear this up a little bit. It's easier to tear up if you've been soaking in a little bit of water. It tears just a little bit easier and then you don't have to do it. Now remember how, oh, that one's got water squeezing out, so that we want it just right. And then this, a paper towel roll. That is also made out of paper. So we can tear this into pieces. And put it in our bin. Our worms love empty towel paper rolls and empty toilet paper rolls. See how much easier it was to tear when it was wet? Let's do this. This. And remember, we want to get them into small pieces because worms don't have very big mouths. And the smaller that you put the pieces, the easier it is for the worms to eat and the faster they will compost this. Oh, stray piece. We need a little bit more. So I'm going to take my paper, put it in some water, that way I don't have to use my spray bottle so much. Bring it out a little bit and put it on top. Let's see. Looks good. Paper needs a little bit more moisture. Now, another reason why that we always want to cover the food is because that's going to prevent bad smells and fruit flies. We wouldn't like our worms if they smelled bad, and our parents probably wouldn't like it if we got fruit flies in the house. So by covering the food scraps, that helps keep the smell to zero, and it also prevents fruit flies. Oh. That paper feels just right. See, it doesn't wring out any water when I squeeze it, and it still feels moist in my hand. Now, if we accidentally put too much water in, what we would do is then we would just add more shredded paper. We would add more bedding. Now, what would we do though if we didn't have any shredded paper at home or we didn't have any food scraps, but we knew that our worms were hungry? Then we could add things like grass clippings. Like let's say that you've got some clover growing in your yard or some dandelions. Now, I like dandelions because they help feed the bees, but not everybody does. So you can go and pick those dandelions, shred them up, and put them in your compost bin. The worms will think they're delicious. Okay, it's time to add our worms. Now we're just going to pull the bedding aside a little bit so we can expose the food. And then I've got some worms here in a bowl. So I am going to put some worms in here. Notice I did leave a little of that compost in there with them, and then I'm going to cover them up with bedding. Oh, worm on top. He probably doesn't like being on top, so we're going to put him down below. Worms are photosensitive, which means that they really don't like light, and so we're always going to keep them covered. If you ever see worms coming to the surface, that means that your soil is too damp and that they need to breathe a little bit. And so they're going to come up to the air, or they're going to come up above ground so that they can breathe. That's the reason why when it rains, the soil gets too damp, and so worms come up so that they don't drown. Now, remember to put your lid on your worm bin use those locking handles or locking sides. If you don't have something that locks like that, put a couple of rubber bands around it, because remember, if the worm bin happens to topple over or fall down or your dog knocks into it, we don't want the worms and the food scraps and the castings to all fall out and get all over the floor. By keeping this with rubber bands around it or with locking handles, that makes sure that our worms stay nice and safe. Now, remember we said that worms do not like light, so we're going to put this in a dark corner. Like I could put this in my pantry, or I keep mine, remember I've got a big one, I keep it in a dark corner of my kitchen. You could also put it, if you've got a tablecloth around your kitchen table, you could put it underneath there. You can put it in a cabinet. Just make sure that it has good airflow along the sides. Now, if you're going to put it up in a cabinet or you're going to put it someplace that you're worried about moisture leaking out, make sure that you put a plastic tray or newspapers underneath, because remember we have holes on the bottom that can catch that water. Remember, if we overwater, liquid comes out and we don't want to drown our worms. We don't want them sitting in that water. Now remember, worm poop is called castings, and that castings that's really good life force food for the soil for when we plant our plants or when we need to feed our plants. So how are we going to harvest our castings? We're going to bring out our bin, and we can either spread it out and search through it, or what I like to do is I like to put the food all on one side, wait a week, and then I know the food on the other, or the soil on the other side, should be pretty worm-free because they're going to stay right where the food is. Now, this is some castings that I took out this morning. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of eggshell that's still not ground up, and there's a little bit of a stem from a plant that I didn't get small enough, so it's still in there, but that's totally okay. It's okay to put that in your garden, and you're going to harvest these. Now remember, we can sprinkle these around our potted plants to help give them food. We can sprinkle them whenever we're planting seeds. You can put a little bit in each hole, or if you're planting carrots in a row where you've got that trough, you can sprinkle them in that, or you can put them in the pot whenever you're putting them in your planting them, the seedlings, in little tiny pots. If we're going to be making potting soil, we're going to mix up a couple of different things, but don't ever put more than 1/4 castings. So 1 part castings and 3 parts something else, and pot our plants that way. And then we can also mix this with water and water our plants with a watering can, and that's called compost tea. I don't want to drink this tea, but that's the kind of tea that our plants like to drink. Now, if you wanted to look for cocoons in your composting bin, well, those cocoons are what the baby worms are going to be in. You can dig through this, and the cocoons are going to look like little teeny tiny yellow jelly beans. Don't eat them though. Those are not good jelly beans to eat. Those are jelly bean looking things that are where baby worms will be someday. Now, when I feed my worms, or before I put the worm bin away after I've made a new worm bin, I like to sing my worms a lullaby, just so they'll know that they are beloved pets of mine and that I appreciate all the hard work they do. So Miss Elf, who is another person on the children's team, she and I wrote a lullaby for our worms. It's called Worm Song, and it goes like this. Red worm, wiggle worm, living in the dirt. Happy worm, munchy worm, squirm, squirm, squirm. Isn't that a silly thing to do? Now, if you want to learn more about worms in a fun way and how they help our garden, because not only do they make that compost or the worm castings to help our our flowers grow and our vegetables grow, and to help eat all of those food scraps that were going to go into the landfill, they also aerate the soil so the soil doesn't get too heavy. If you want to learn more fun things about worms in a fun book, I recommend this book called Yucky Worms by Vivian French. This book is about a little boy who thinks that worms are yucky until his grandmother brings him out into the garden and shows him what worms do to help us. Thank you for visiting us today. We hope to see you in the library soon. Bye.
If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and follow us on social media. Daniel Boone Regional Library.